here is the science behind that last experiment. So the amount of reactant affects the reaction rate. We've seen that by doing the experiment, and this is the reason why. So the amount of the reactant added affects the rate of reaction because as you add more of something, it takes up more room within that area. So this increases the chances of it colliding with other particles and therefore speeding up the reaction. So it's kind of similar to temperature, except that when you add more of something, it takes up more room as opposed to just moving faster. So if you imagine you had more of the reactant particles in there, so more of the particles, as well as increasing the temperature, if we hadn't controlled temperature, then you would get an extra super fast reaction because you'd have extra particles as well as particles with more energy because of the heat. So an example of this is adding more people into a small space. So if we pick a room somewhere in the school, imagine the corridor. If there are only a few people in the corridor outside B block, then you don't crash into each other. But if I let all the classes out in the corridor at the end of period 1, for example, and everyone's trying to get outside and move to their next class, then all those people in that small space are going to start crashing into each other. So that's the same thing. If I let 1 or 2 of you out at a time, then you're not going to bang into each other. But if I let lots of you out at once, then you are, because you've got more people in that smaller space. Same as if you've got more particles in the same small space. So when you did your experiment, you added more hydrochloric acid into the test tube, and that took up more space. So that's why the reaction rate got faster. So now you need to copy this note into your notes. If you're using the drag and drop digital notes, then this is slide 31. Ignore slides 32 and 33 because they're actually in the wrong place, but you can add in this example to slide 31. If you're copying this note into your book, you'll need to just pause the video until you've copied it and then start it again, because there are some more activities for you to do in this one here. So pause it now and then start it again once you've got that note written. Okay, so hopefully now you've started it because you have copied that note into your notes. These are some questions that you're now going to have a go at just to check your understanding of amount of reactants and how they affect the reaction rate. So have a go at these questions. Once you've done them, check the answers with me so that I can see how you're getting on and you can see whether you've got them right or not. Use your note to help you, and pause this video again so that you can answer these questions. If you're using the drag and drop notes, then you can just create a new slide and answer them on there and then show me when you're ready for me to check them. Once you've done that, then start the video again because you're going to do one more task. So that one more task that you're going to do is you're going to write another paragraph. So this paragraph is going to explain the ideas that you've just talked about or learnt about, looking at amount of reactants and how that affects the reaction rate. So what we're thinking about here is, why do we need to control the amount of reactants when doing an experiment that looks at reaction rate? You wrote a similar paragraph about temperature and why you need to control temperature, but now we're going to look at the amount of reactants and why we have to control it. So things to think about are what happens if you add more of a reactant or a chemical. In your example it was hydrochloric acid, so what happens if you add more of that into the experiment, and why does that make the reaction rate speed up? Or what happens if you add less of it, and how does that affect the reaction rate? Does it make it happen as quickly or does it make it slow down? Then think about if you were doing an experiment that doesn't look at amount of reactants, if we're focusing on something else, say for example concentration of reactants, which will be your next experiment. If you're focusing on concentration of reactants and that's the thing you wanted to see the effect of, then if you change the amount each time or the temperature each time, it's going to affect your reaction rate. So write about perhaps what could happen if you don't control the amount of the reactants when you're doing an experiment that is not actually interested in the amount of reactants. Once again, once you've completed your paragraph, share it with me or get me to check it so that I can see how you're getting on.